Now, would you say those things were typical of the time, both the publisher kind of pushing his own political agenda,
Well,
and also reporters
I think that Mr. Annenberg went beyond what was normally done, but yes, I do think that it was a different time, and editors like Harry Ashmore and others had behind-the-scenes involvement in the stories that their staff were covering. And we know today that's not a good thing. It's difficult for me to say to judge, don't want to judge people of another era, but that was what was accepted at the time. But I think that to the extent really corrupting the news coverage, that certainly the Annenberg regime at the Enquirer was not good, and that was Knight Ridder bought the paper. Knight newspapers, the predecessor of Knight Ridder, bought the paper January 1, 1970. Gene Roberts was its second editor, came in October 72, and I joined the paper in February 73. And we were dealing with the residue of that era. And so definitely we needed to try to change the course. Now, we did have our own problem in 76 and 7 when a reporter, same last name as mine, but we're not related, Laura Foreman, was found to have been involved in a romantic relationship with Harry, Buddy Cianfrani, who was then a Pennsylvania state senator from Philadelphia, who was one of the leading political forces in the state. She was covering politics, clearly a conflict of interest, which she had denied to Gene Roberts. But when the FBI investigated Cianfrani, who was eventually sent to prison on corruption charges, they found evidence of multiple gifts to Laura, which kind of proved the relationship. And so that led to Gene Roberts to say we need to write a conflict of interest code of ethics so that everybody understands what we stand for. That we now not only are trying to live down the reputation of the Annenberg Enquirer, which a lot of people are not aware there's been a change, but we got our own problem that we need to try to overcome. So that was a period in which I think that certainly at the Enquirer, but in the newsrooms generally across the country, things were starting to change.
So there had.
And nowhere was this more marked than in the acceptance of gifts from people that we covered, whether it be politicians or businesses. And I remember when I first started working at the Arkansas Gazette, that the electric company, the Arkansas Power and Light, would give everybody in the newsroom a gift. And you could look around and see the guy who covered the State Public Service Commission would get a big electric oven. Other people would get a toaster or something. So there was a pecking order. And I asked people, what about this? And they said, oh, this is just part of the business. We don't get paid very much. And so free admissions and gifts are just part of the trade. And the racetrack, Oaklawn at Hot Springs, would throw a big party every year for the press, which is kind of the big social event of the year. And nobody thought a lot about that.
So in drafting a code of ethics for the Enquirer, could you talk about what that process was?
Yeah.
Who actually was involved and how you came up with what the provisions should be?
Yes, Gene asked me to make sure it got done, which is kind of the way things a managing editor would do. And we also discussed that it ought to be a staff committee that and I would say to this day, and and I try to point this out to aspiring journalists in my book, is that an awareness in thinking about journalism ethics comes not just from the newsroom leaders, although they're certainly important, but from the rank and file. That peer pressure to do the right thing is probably more effective than us saying, here's the guideline or the rule for the newsroom as the managing editor. So we wanted we were aware that a very strong feeling in the newsroom about what had happened, say, in the Laura Foreman case. They felt that they had been tarnished by this, and as much as the newspaper's name, that they individually had suffered a loss of credibility, a loss of professional self-esteem because of that. So we got staff members involved, and Jim Naughton became the kind of the scribe who we'd have meetings and talk about it, and Jim would then kind of codify and issue proposed guidelines that we'd all then discuss again. And my part was to try to survey what was out there. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and I think when you ever do something like this, you try to take advantage of what someone else has already done. And so I called a bunch of newspapers, called the AS&E and APME, and tried to find out what newspapers had code.
And then how do you, once you have this code, how do you make it sort of work in the day-to-day life of the newsroom? Because I remember reading an article once where, you know, journalists were asked about their paper's code of ethics, and they would say things like, "Oh yeah, I think we've got one around here somewhere. Let me, you know," and they were rummaging around in a drawer. And so, you know, it's one thing to develop a code of ethics, so another to actually, you know, there's two issues. One, you know, what do you do if somebody violates it? So there's the enforcement of an issue, and then the other is just the sort of the awareness and ongoing sort of training of reporters.
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that we did recognize that it's not going to do any good if it sits in an office drawer and is ignored, that it would defeat the purpose of what we were trying to do. And we, of course, have a guild union in the newsroom, and in that time the policy of the National Labor Relations Board on newsroom codes of ethics was not fully formed. As a matter of fact, during that period, the Madison newspaper in Wisconsin issued a comprehensive guideline on freebies and say that we're not going to accept free tickets. We're not going to do the sort of thing that today is a given. But the union took them to the NLRB, unfair labor practice, that you have to bargain this, and an administrative judge had agreed initially with the union, saying that you're taking compensation away from them, saying they couldn't take free tickets, and you do have to bargain. The NLRB eventually then, in the 70s, did set aside that ruling and said that yes, you can write your own code of ethics, but you can't enforce them like other work rules that are in the contract. And we were fine with that. We wanted not to have our principles watered down in the labor bargaining process, and we were willing to deal with it without the teeth of a work rule that could be enforced on the contract. So two things immediately brought home to the staff that we had a code of ethics. One was that the book editor was found to have been sending review copies to the Strand bookstore in New York to be resold, and he would then pocket the money from the review books that had been sent to him. Interestingly enough, he had been a part of the committee that had written the code and provided the language that review books may not be sold under any circumstances. The APME was doing a study, and some editor got a staff member hired by the Strand bookstore who made notes on which book editors were sending books in, and our guy was one of them. So we couldn't fire him because for violating the code of ethics, because it didn't have the standing of a contractual work rule. But we removed him as a book editor, and he eventually, fairly soon left the paper. Then the nightlife columnist was found to be going into business, establishing a something that would be covered by his nightlife column, and would be in partnership with someone that, by our count, going back into the archives, had been mentioned favorably 56 times in the last year. So Gene Roberts told him, you can't go into this business and continue to be our nightlife columnist. And he said, well, I'm going to go into this business. And Gene said, you're no longer our nightlife columnist. and then he soon left the paper. We didn't go out and advertise it. Everybody in the newsroom knew about it. So they knew that we now had a code and it meant something. And as we went on orientation, we'd give them not only, I would send them a copy when they were hired, and then when they come to work, we would try to have a groups of staffers who had come over a period of 3 to 6 months would gather for a day, and one of the sessions would be on talking about the conflict of interest codes, and I would give them about 20 hypothetical situations, and then we'd talk about how the code would apply to it. So it was as new people came in, they got some kind of formal indoctrination on the code.
So you were managing editor of the Inquirer during some pretty turbulent times
Yes.
in Philadelphia. Can you think of any, thorny ethics issues that came up in the coverage of the city or the world beyond the city during your tenure there, where you really had to make some tough decisions?
Having to give up a child that they had bonded with and so forth, and I mean, I don't see heroes and villains in this thing, because I think that the birth mother had a legal right to ask for the baby back, but it clearly was an emotional problem. Well, our reporter apparently had arrived for a news conference when this story began, and not a good idea, but they said, okay, then everything is agreed. Well, he had not heard everything, but he agreed. And then, so we've reported this childless couple now is going to lose the baby, and this story went on for some time. And another reporter covered it, and this reporter asked, what is this 3-year-old child doing in the house? And they said, and the other reporter said, well, that's the child we're not supposed to report. That apparently the deal was, which is certainly ethically wrong, was that they had accepted that they would not mention the other child in return for getting access to the couple. And of course, our reporter, turn the clock back, should have said, well, what are the guidelines, because I missed them. And they would have said, absolutely not, I'm not accepting that. And then it would have been ejected, and we wouldn't have had access, but we certainly could have covered the story and reported it correctly all along. But our reporter had been considered having given the people his word that he would not report on it, and we were saying, well, we're not going to continue lying to our audience that they're a childless couple. And it wasn't explained very well by us in the paper why we had done this, which I think is another thing we've learned about ethics, is that you need to be transparent. You need to try to explain everything. And we just said that we had discovered this and that we were now reporting it, and which led some people to write letters to the editor saying, well, what is there? Is a rule you can only have one child or something like this? What difference does it make? And they missed the point. The difference was not whether you can have one child or 2 or 10, but do we tell you the truth, the readers the truth? And that meant having to renege on a promise an ill-considered promise that our agent had made. So that's the kind of things that come up, and I think that with the benefit of the kind of training that we're trying to give our students now, that even though I've been in the business a good while, I could have handled it a lot better. And I think the main thing there would have been to tell the audience specifically why we thought it was important that we report this now. That we were not concerned about the number of children, but rather the truth of what we were reporting.